My name is Dave Hollenbach, the host of From Embers to Excellence, a podcast that explores the many facets of leadership from the perspectives of some amazing people. We discuss the triumphs and failures that have shaped our lives and our leadership philosophies. I've found that it isn't whether we fail that defines us, but when we do fail, how we respond. Leaders dust off the ashes and use their failures as fuel to work harder and as lessons to come back wiser and stronger, more resilient, more determined, and more committed to excellence. Today I'm speaking with Christian de la Huerta. With 30 years of experience, he is a sought-after spiritual teacher, personal transformation coach, and leading voice in the breathwork community. He has traveled the world offering inspiring and transformational retreats, combining psychological and spiritual teachings with lasting and life-changing effects. He is an award-winning, critically acclaimed author. He has spoken at numerous universities and conferences, and as a matter of fact, he's been on the TedX stage, very well received. His new book, Awakening the Soul of Power, was described by multiple Grammy Award winner Gloria Estefan as, quote unquote, a balm for the soul of anyone searching for truth and answers to life's difficult questions. And I'll put it at the beginning of the interview and at the end, and your website, Christian, will be in the show notes as well. But just for all of those listening, if you happen to be in front of your computer, you can check out his website right now as we're going through the interview. But you can find him at www.soulful, SOULFUL, power, POWER.com. And you can also find his book there and join his mailing list uh, there on his website as well. So, to dive right in, Christian, you're in Miami, I'm in Orlando. Um, there's been a lot going on down there with the condominium collapse, and um, the weather hasn't been all that great with the tropical depression and the whatever storm was out there. But I was wondering, were you born and raised in Miami?
No, David, I wasn't. And by the way, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. And I love the work that you're doing on the podcast. I know that it's making a big difference in many lives. So no, I was born in Cuba. I lived my first 10 years of life in Cuba. Um, which for most Americans, it's really hard to get what it's like to grow up in a communist regime and really autocratic, dictatorial system of government. And so in that sense, it's kind of ironic that I'm writing about personal empowerment because in that kind of regime, there is no such thing, right? The government, the state owns you and tells you what to do. End of story. I was also raised in a really Catholic environment, family. And with all due respect, that was also a very hierarchical, power structure. Power comes from above, and pope to archbishops to cardinals to archbishops to bishops to priests, etc. And you're pretty much told, right, what to believe in and what's right and what's wrong. So it's really ironic that I'm writing about what it means to live heroically in the 21st century, and how do we step into power, in a personal power, in a different way that is not hierarchical. I'm actually really grateful for my first 10 years in Cuba because, we had a TV, but there was nothing worth watching. So we grew up reading. And I developed this lifelong love affair with books and words. And for that, I'm really grateful because I became a really good student. It was easy for me to learn how to study. Um, and we also, because there was no TV, we grew up playing outside and inventing our own games and having adventures and creating pastimes. And it's sad to me to see how many kids today are just like, with their nose to the screen, totally disconnected from nature and from even connection with others, in third dimensional reality. So one of the things that happens, that because my parents were counter revolutionaries, so they're actually conspired, against the Castro regime in the beginning, in collaboration with the CIA from here. And out of their pot of friends that were actively involved, they were the only ones who weren't, shot, who weren't or spent 20 years in prison, political prison. So because of that, there was an implicit message to kind of not let not let yourself be seen too much. Like, it's hard for us to get it here in the States, but in Cuba, I don't know if that's still the case, but in those days, there was definitely what they call a defense committee. So in every single city block, there was one house that was like paid by the government to be a stool pigeon, right? So they watched the goings and comings of everybody and reported to the Secret Service. And so there was that sense of, like literally living in fear. Um, and because of that, we were conditioned, like to not show up too much, right? To kind of hide like kind of hide away if you could. And so one of the results of that is I became really introverted. And when we came over to the States, I didn't speak a word of English. And we first lived in a small town in Georgia for 3 years while my father, who was a psychiatrist, got his licensing here, so that he could practice medicine here. And so, it's like I couldn't even speak. There was nobody in my class who spoke Spanish. So it was kind of a sink or swim, but I was a good student, like I said. So I pretty much had a 4.0 in high school, except for one B. And I didn't set out to do this intentionally, but I know now, looking back on it, that subconsciously I sabotaged my grade point average by getting that one B, because there is no way that I could have gotten up in front of a room of hundreds of people and deliver the valedictorian speech. And I share that story because that's part of the theme and the teachings that I talk about in the book. Is like, how do we free ourselves from all the ways in which we have given up our power, in which we have played small, in which we have allowed ourselves to be held back by fears and the self-made prison of fear and limitation, and all the conditioning from childhood and all the stuff that we took on. And so, like, these days, as you were saying in the introduction, I speak all over the world. I've spoken in dozens of universities and the TEDx stage, so that I know how to transcend all those obstacles and all those fears.
Yeah, that's incredible. We spoke a little bit before beginning the interview, and I shared with you that I haven't finished your book, but I've been blown away. I've actually been focusing on the first few chapters. I've reread them a couple of times, and in the first chapter, I'm pretty sure it's the first chapter where you talk about growing up in Cuba and then coming to the States, and really, um, some of the adversity that you faced, and really struggling with your own personal identity
Yeah,
and being authentic.
yeah,
And I've had several conversations with other guests regarding the value of being authentic, and not just in you know living a good life, a happy life, but how it applies to being a really good leader as well. And um, and so I was wondering if we could start off maybe talking about some of those early experiences that shaped you and who you are, and how you overcame those adversities, and really, you know, how you were able to harness that that courage to be truly authentic.
yeah. Good question, David. Um, Yeah, I think what you're pointing to is, in addition to my introvertedness, I was also my adolescence was one long depression with suicidal fantasies. Um, because at a young age I knew that I was gay. And so it was such a difficult thing to try to reconcile my authentic self, my sexuality and my spirituality, the religion in which I was raised that told me that I was going to burn to hell for eternity, um, for being who I was, for being who I am. And I remember being a kid and asking this priest, how long is eternity exactly? And coming from an island environment, he said, well, imagine that you're going to go to the beach with a thimble and you start taking water out of the ocean with a thimble. Well, that's eternity, which terrified me because to put things in context, in Catholicism, there's different kinds of sins. There's like a hierarchy of sins. And so there's your menial sins that are like you're lying, you're cheating, you're stealing, that, they're not that big of a deal. But then there's your whole other category of mortal sins, which means that if you have committed one of those and you haven't received forgiveness or absolution directly from a priest, right? This cannot be done directly. It has to be facilitated by a priest. That means that you go to hell for eternity. And to put things in further context, these days, masturbation is still considered a mortal sin. Like most priests don't hold it that way and don't put that fear in people, but it still is. And so not to mention the unmentionable sin that I was really worried about. So that's why I say that my adolescence was one long depression. Plus my dad being a psychiatrist, there was a whole other layer of like guilt. Oh my God, what if it comes out? Will people think that the psychiatrist is a failure because his son turned out gay? Like so much internalized homophobia and so anyway, like how does one break out through all that? Because these days, like no matter the details of my life, like a relationship works out or it doesn't, a project succeeds or it fails, in quotes, no matter the circumstances, I never ever question my sense of worth. Like that is healed. That is not only self-acceptance but self-love and self-respect and self-honoring. And so that's why I also know, like everything that I write about in this book is from personal experience. Yeah, I'm influenced by other teachers and I bring in quotes and teachings from others, but everything is stuff that I have lived and practiced and still do, so that I know the stuff works. And so, it all begins with, that's why I write that, why this book is part of a series of 3, which the series is called Calling All Heroes. Like, what does it mean to live heroically in the 21st century? And in which, by the way, is one of the ways in which COVID has served us, without minimizing the tragic parts of it. It's taught us to expand what we think of heroism. Like before, we used to think either a superhero with a cape and that landing on your knee thing, or like you, right? Like the first responders, the firefighters, the warriors, the people who literally place their lives at risk for the sake of someone else or for the sake of a cause. Now, because of COVID, we have expanded that to include our medical professionals, our doctors, our nurses, our respiratory therapists, and we've even included our delivery people and our grocery store clerks who literally place their lives at risk to keep the rest of us fed and provided for. But what about the rest of us, right? And that's what this book asks. Like, what does it mean to live a heroic life in the 21st century when we don't have a horse hitched outside and the armors and the demons to slay, except the ones inside of our own heads? And so, that's the first step, is that willingness and that courage to look inside and to ask the hard questions. Why do we do the things we do? And why do certain people trigger us and certain circumstances? And why do we create certain patterns of behaviors and certain patterns of relationships that sometimes have us feeling like we're in the same boring movie, just with a different actor? But it's like, hey, we've been here before. And so what's up with that, right? So that's what the first part of the book is all about, understanding the mind, the ego mind, and help us understand the self-made prison that we find ourselves in, so that we can let ourselves free, because nobody else can do that for us.
It occurred to me that you were talking about your father being a psychiatrist, and I don't know at what point the I think it's what the DSM-5 when they actually changed that, because initially homosexuality was considered to be like a deviant behavior, that
Yeah.
there was like some kind of mental defect that caused it. I mean, like at at the time that you came out, what was the conversation like with your father? I mean, I don't I haven't read enough of your book to know what the relationship was like between you and your father, but maybe you can share.
Yeah. And I think it was definitely before DSM-5. It was before DSM-3, because when I was in college, studying psychology, it was DSM-3. So I think that was taken off the list of illnesses. I think it was like 73. So it was earlier on. Um, my father was an amazing man. He was a brilliant man, and in so many ways. And he was a really good psychiatrist. I know, because so many people have told me after the fact. I used to go to him. But in terms of his own emotions, he was clueless. He was clueless. And as I was, right? As was I. Like 30 years ago, I couldn't tell you what I was feeling, because I had no idea what I was feeling. And that's how he was. And I think it was a combination of this more mental approach, like the superiority of reason over the emotions, and that somewhere along the way, somebody had the brilliant idea of labeling the emotions weakness. And especially for us men, since we were kids, we were told little boys don't cry, right? And there's so much like unspoken stuff about fear of homosexuality and gender identity and all this stuff, because if little boys don't cry, that means only little girls cry, and you certainly don't want to be that, right? Because that's weakness, which is completely twisted. This misperception, or this misunderstanding, or the labeling of the feminine as weakness is totally twisted and just not true. If you want to talk power, let's talk about the power of creation that lies in a female body, the power of creating life. It's like, wow, that's power. And in so many other ways. But because somewhere along the way we label the emotions weakness, we run away from them, all of us, but mostly men. And there's a price to pay for that. There's a price to pay for that. What used to be spiritual teaching, that everything is energy, now we know from quantum physics that it's true. Everything is energy. That means our bodies, our emotions, everything is energy. This microphone standing in front of me. Energy, we know from physics, cannot be destroyed. It can only change forms. So just because we stuff emotions, because we label them weakness, doesn't mean they go away. They get stuck and suppressed in the subconscious, where they're still having an effect. They're still impacting our relationships and the quality of our lives. We're just not aware of what we're doing or why we do the things we do. And that's why this journey of going within, it's nothing short of heroic, because it's the willingness to ask ourselves the hard questions, the existential questions. And so the thing about the suppressing the emotions, that there's a huge price to pay, because what happens is we suppress. And after a lifetime, decades of suppressing emotions, we walk around with layers upon layers upon layers of repressed emotional crap. And here we are trying to have a relationship in the present moment, and it's all getting filtered through that lifetime of suppressed emotions, which we then start dumping on each other's laps and projecting on each other. Like, it boggles my mind that any relationship can work, because we haven't been taught about how to approach them, how to hold them, and we certainly haven't been taught how to clear ourselves of all this cauldron of suppressed emotions. The other thing that happens, as you know, as a coach, and as a guide, and as a leader in for so many years in the fire department, is that if we don't express those emotions, they can only come out, right? They're going to come out one way or the other. So we suppress, we suppress, we suppress. Then the next unfortunate one just happens to hit us at the wrong day, at the wrong moment, rubs us the wrong way, and boom, volcanic eruption, causing harm to our relationships, sometimes irreparably. Or we suppress, we suppress, we suppress. That energy has to come out. And so it starts seeping out and showing up in the body as physical symptoms: cancer, heart attacks, ulcers. And so it's not an effective strategy. It doesn't work.
You touched on something, and I told you earlier I definitely wanted to discuss it. And you started off chapter 3, and if you don't mind, I'd like to read that sentence. All right?
Of course.
So this stems from my conviction that the single most important thing that needs to happen in our world is the empowerment of women. And so the title of that chapter is Desperately Seeking Balance. And it talks about the authentic expression of soulful power. And you go on to talk about really how men need to embrace the power of their own personal femininity and not run away from it.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a huge, conversation, an important one. So yeah, the book has a particular message for the empowerment of women, stemming from that belief that that is the single most important thing that needs to happen in the world. And that, to me, that's strategic thinking. It's not about idealizing women. It's not about putting women up on a pedestal. Women are also capable of abusing power, right? But it just happens to have been done very disproportionately in the last several thousand years, that we've been in the patriarchy, where men have held all the power, or most of it anyway. And so when I think about, like what needs to happen in the world, like if I'm going to think strategically, what is one thing that I can focus my limited time on this planet to make a difference in, that will then impact other areas? That's what I land on. Because when women are in 50% of power in this world, we're going to have a very different relationship to war and poverty and hunger and power and how we treat the environment and all of it. Social justice, wealth distribution, all of it. And again, it's not to idealize one over the other. It's because of this imbalance of power that you were mentioning. We've just been running really off balance between the masculine and the feminine, which are energies, right, that everybody has running through them, because that's what the universe is. It's a combination of masculine and feminine energies. So much to the surprise of some humans, we're part of the universe. We're part of the cosmos. So we too have both masculine and feminine energies coursing through us. The problem is that we suppress them because we've labeled them weakness. And by the way, that's the reason men get into trouble. Like if we look at some numbers really quickly, the rate of longevity in this country, women outlive men by 5 years. If we look at the numbers globally, it's 7 years. What's up with that? And if we look at the rate of suicides in this country, I don't have the global ones for suicide, but in the US, men commit suicide, take their lives 4 times as frequently as women. 70% of all the suicides in this country are committed by middle-aged white men. Like, isn't that weird? Like the group that still holds the majority of the power in the world. So what's up with that? And I think that connects to what we were talking about earlier, the price we pay, for this limited, twisted misunderstanding of what it means to be masculine, of what it means to be a man. And so because we've got all this conditioning and all this misunderstanding around it, we walk around afraid of the emotions and afraid to feel. And we walk around like hyper protected and DEFCON 1, just waiting for the next shoe to drop, sometimes sneaking in the first punch just in case. And there's a price to pay for that in our relationships and in our health and in the quality of our lives.
when I was introducing you, I mentioned that you're a sought after spiritual teacher. And with your background and upbringing in Catholicism, and I noticed there's a statue of the Buddha behind you. And so I would imagine that you've studied Buddhism. Um, but where would you say your spirituality lies right now? Maybe what talk a little bit about your philosophy on
Hmm.
religion, spirituality, just your
That's a
philosophy in general.
that's a beautiful, very thoughtful question, David. Thank you. Yeah, these days I think I fall in the category of spiritual, not religious. Um, and it took me a while, because my adolescence was one long depression. Once I hit my late teens, early 20s, and fell in love and discover and began to question, the way in which I had been raised and the philosophy and the worldview in which I had been raised. I, like many people, threw the baby out with a baptismal water. I wanted nothing to do with God, or I just couldn't accept that if there was such a thing as a deity that intervened in human affairs in a personal way, that how could it allow such needless pain and such needless suffering, not only in my own life, but in the countless millions of people throughout history who have gone to death feeling like there was something wrong with them. Um, and I'm not just talking gay people, by the way, I'm talking anybody, because of mistaken and misinterpreted moral teachings. That all the teachings about making sexuality a bad thing and demonizing it. It's like, oh my God, the amount of suffering that has caused. Um, and so towards my late 20s, I had a pretty enviable, cushy life. I had a great job and condo on the water and sports car and all that good stuff. And yet, the more that I had and the more that I was sought after, the more that it started feeling to me like there's got to be more. Like this can't be all there is to life. So I began exploring. I had turned eastward and I began to look at some of the Eastern traditions and some of the indigenous traditions, in which, by the way, that split between the sacred and the physical, between sexuality and spirituality, isn't there. In many Eastern religions, sexuality was considered a valid path to union with the sacred. And in many indigenous traditions, they just don't have that split. To them, everything is sacred. The trees and the rocks and the fish in the seas and the creepy crawlies and the winged ones and the genitals and the bedroom, right? It's if God is, but if we're going to go by the Western teachings that God is omnipresent, that God is everywhere, then don't tell me that God is everywhere except for the bedroom and the genitals, right? That just doesn't add up. So it's either everywhere or it's not. And so, but I'm kind of getting sidetracked. And what's a fascinating conversation to me, like how do we bridge this chasm between the sexuality and spirituality? And so, these days, like I honor all traditions. Like I think all traditions are valid paths, and they all hold a piece of the truth. And there's so much commonality, like really important commonalities between them. Like the ethic of reciprocity. If we lived only by do unto others as you would like them to do unto you, which you find a version of that in every religion, like what a world would we live in? And so I honor them all and I challenge them all too. Right. So the way that I see it is if you can imagine the sacred or God, whatever that word is for you, as this beautiful, exquisite, organically shaped, perfectly landscaped, perfect temperature swimming pool with a bunch of diving boards around it. That to me, that's what the religions represent. So to the degree that they are helping us to dive into like that experience and that connection with the sacred, then they're doing their job. And there are many ways to get there. To the degree that they're fostering us, are becoming more loving, more compassionate, better human beings, then they're doing their job. And to the degree that they're causing fear and separation in what I call the theological pissing contest, my God is bigger than yours. And it's like, how tragic and how twisted that the number of wars throughout human history that are based on religion, it is absurd. It's ridiculous. And it's not okay. It's really not okay. And so it is like completely antithetical to what any religion fundamentally really is, and certainly what the sacred is about. And so another way that informs me about this is like, if we look at the Latin roots, the word religion comes from the Latin religare, which means to rebind. I assume it means rebind to the sacred. But to me, that still feels kind of, restrictive. Whereas the word spirituality comes from the Latin root spirare, and from that root we get both respiration and inspiration or expiration. So that connection between breath and spirit, in so many religions, one word can mean breath or spirit, depending on the context. And so that feels more resonant to me. Like, I relate to that a lot more, because the breath, if the breath is spirit, right? If it's the life-giving breath that the sacred texts talk about, we all have access to it indiscriminately. And so that's the kind of spirituality that I relate to more.
Can you talk about your path to really finding your spirituality?
Yeah. Well, it was like started there in my, like I was talking about, when I hit this existential point as I was approaching 30, and like started really asking the deeper questions, like, what am I really here for? And so I spent a weekend by myself. I had a partner at the time, and I said, hey, Joe, I just need some time alone this weekend. I didn't watch TV. I didn't allow distractions. I didn't listen to music. I just lived in that question. What do I want from life? And every time I'd get a thought, and it could be a huge altruistic thought, or it could be completely petty. I wasn't evaluating yet, right? So I would just write it down. I kept writing, came up with like a list of 100 things. Then once nothing was coming out, nothing else was coming out, then I started eliminating. What do I really want from life? And that was like the majority of the weekend was that, like eliminating. And finally got it down to 3. And let me see if I can remember what they were. I wanted to fulfill my potential as a human being. And that meant, to me, in every sense of the word, right? So physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, which I had neglected for a few years. So it was that calling to reclaim my spirituality and find a way to express it that was a match for me. And then I wanted to discover my purpose, like my real soul level, mission level work. And then the third one was I wanted to travel and see the world and meet people from all different walks of life and cultures. I put my list away. I never saw it again. It's probably sitting in one of my books. But I think getting so clear was catalytic. And 6 months later is when I first heard about breathwork. And it was like an immediate, yep, I want to do that. Tell me when, how much. And in my very first session, everything changed. It's a breathing practice that you do. You breathe in a particular way for an hour and a half, that comes out of the yoga tradition, but was discovered independently here in the West.
Are you by any chance talking about Kundalini yoga?
There's so many different types of breath work, and that's one of them. There's a lot of different breathing practices that they do in Kundalini yoga. This is a longer thing, right? This is, you do it for like an hour and a half. Some traditions do it longer. Some traditions you do it for like 3-4 hours, breathing in a circular connected way, and amazing things happen. Like my very first session, I knew without any doubt that I would never be the same. And I wasn't, ever. Like my life was going in a certain direction. I was on a path to get a PhD in psychology. I jumped tracks. I never went for the PhD. And, I've been teaching breathwork now and practicing it for the last 30 years. And I do it all over the world and with high level people. Like before the pandemic, I was going to China, 3-4 times a year, working with really high level corporate leaders and tech leaders, millionaires and billionaires. So there's breathwork is kind of following the same path that meditation took and then yoga before that in the West. I think breathwork isn't quite there yet in terms of people being aware of it and its benefits, but it's headed in that direction. And it just works. I don't know anything more effective in healing past trauma. And I'm talking about people that I've worked with serious trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, people who've survived dramatic, violent stuff, and it gets healed. It gets healed. And which, by the way, with all due respect to the psychotherapy process, in the right hands, with clear intentions and goals, it can be profoundly helpful and transformational. And we all know you can sit on somebody's couch for 5, 10, 20, 30 years, repeating the same old crap, and nothing really happens, right? The reason for that is that because understanding up here in the mind, what happened to us when we were 5 or 10 or 15, it's good. It's better than being unconscious about it, than having it lurking in the subconscious. But the problem is that trauma no longer lives in the mind, has now moved into the body and has been somaticized and lives in the tissues and the cellular memory of our bodies. And so no amount of talking about it is going to get to it. So it's a great combination to, like, I have therapists who refer people to me when people hit a plateau, when they're stuck, when they need, some movement in their therapy process, because it just works fast and heals so profoundly at so many levels. It's an amazing practice.
I'm curious. You said that you've worked with people, that have experienced some severe trauma, which lends me to believe that they probably suffering from PTSD,
Yeah.
seeking to heal from that. And I'm curious if you have applied those practices with the specific intent of healing somebody that's suffering from PTSD.
It just happens, right? It is like I said, I don't know anything more effective. I mean, maybe there is. I just don't know about it. In terms of healing trauma, whatever you call it, PTSD or whatever you want to call it, like it works. It really works. And I've worked with a group of veterans, which I had some misgivings about, because you just never know what's lurking under the surface mind of the mind. And some of these bodies are like trained weapons. And so sometimes in breathwork, you kind of relive. It's a very cathartic process, and a lot of people relive trauma. And so, I know how to handle it. I'm good about creating the safe container. I know how to intervene. But working with a group of vets, I was a little worried about, because I just didn't know. I didn't know what was going to happen. But for a time, I had this guy who was a veteran training with me to teach breathwork. So with him facilitating, I felt more comfortable because he knows more of the mindset. And it was amazing. It was really powerful to witness that.
Got my wheels turning.
Yeah.
So to go back to your book, seeing as I haven't finished it, do you talk about or explain the breath work or guide people on how to do it in your book? Or is
I give some breathing techniques and practices, but I don't teach or guide this kind of longer breath work, because again, it is so powerful. And so I don't feel morally safe for that same reason. I just don't know who's reading it and who's going to listen to a recorded meditation that I create with that particular breathing technique. And if anything happens to them, I don't want to carry that, morally or legally or in any sense of the word, karmically. But there are there's so many breathing techniques, and for any opportunity that any viewer and listener has to learn about breathing, I can't recommend it highly enough. That breath is at the core of every meditation practice. It's at the core of yoga. It's at the core of like just about everything. It's our most loyal, faithful companion on this journey of embodiment. Um, and so many of us have we don't know how to breathe, right? And connecting back to the emotions, like I see it all the time. And if we start paying attention, you notice it. Emotions come up. First thing that happens, we shut down those emotions. I mean, the breathing. We stop breathing, or we start breathing really shallowly. And that's what anchors, right? Those emotional energies in our bodies. So anything you can, like, there's so many classes online now about breathing techniques and yoga breathing techniques. And like the one you were talking about, Kundalini breathing techniques, that just start anywhere, right? And then little by little, you'll be guided to the next step. And it will change your life. It will change your life. Like even what we were talking about earlier about reacting and then regretting, when we have that immediate reaction because somebody hurt us or we interpret it as hurt, and then we react and we get them back. Like it's the breath that allows us to bring choice back into the equation, right? So rather than immediately reacting and then regretting, because inevitably, whenever we react, we're going to regret it. Right? We're going to say or do something that we're going to regret later. Even if initially, that it might feel good, well, I show them, but eventually that energy dissipates. And then we plummet into, my God, how could I have said that? That was mean. That was mean. That's not who I am. That's not who I want to be. And so by learning how to use the breath, we can, kind of hijack this process of reacting and regret. And we can bring choice. It doesn't mean it's all about airy fairy, hallmarky kind of life. Not at all. We're talking about empowerment. So we get to use all of our emotions, including anger, right? But as we use it at choice, not reacting from some subconscious, unhealed stuff that happened when we were 5, and some misunderstanding about ourselves from that experience. All these conclusions that we make about ourselves, that we're not good enough, that there's something wrong with us, that we're damaged goods, that we're too much of this, not enough of that. All of it misunderstandings. So, and that's why this work is heroic. And yes, it's heroic, and yes, it takes work to face our inner demons, but the rewards are so infinite because we can free ourselves. And then we can respond and show up to life into situations from a place of choice, rather than being driven by subconscious stuff that we don't even know about.
We're talking about the breath work. Are there any other practices that you would recommend? And maybe we could talk about some of the next steps. Aside from, first, people need to buy your book.
Yes.
But yeah, are there any practices that you would recommend other than the breath work?
For sure. And yeah, absolutely buy the book, because the book will guide you by the hand. And I've designed it to make it manageable, right? So short chapters, and every chapter has practices at the end. And I try to make it as fun as possible around the hero's journey. So there's maps, and there's try to lighten it up, because it's heroic stuff. It's heavy duty stuff. So trying to use a lot of examples from superhero movies and that kind of thing. And so a different practice that would be really, really helpful is anything you can think of doing that's going to increase your self-awareness, right? That's the starting point. We can't do anything about something that we're not aware about. We can't heal what we can't see, right? So that's the first step, becoming aware of the patterns. So paying attention, right? And related to the conversation about power, for example, you can start asking yourself, what are the patterns? In what kind of situations do I tend to give my power away? Is it, for example, in romantic, intimate, sexual relationships? Or maybe it's in, relationship with authority figures, parental, coaches, bosses, religious leaders, that kind of thing. And so that's the first step, right? So that we can begin to see the pattern, and then we can begin digging deep into, wait a minute, where did that come from? And start going back in time until we can see the source of it, and then clear, because I promise you that at the source of it, it's a misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding about something that we heard or we misheard. So for example, our parents got divorced when we were young, we were 7, 10, whatever. And to that young mind that didn't know any better, it's like, oh my God, daddy left. Doesn't daddy love me? Like, and then the deeper one, it's like, what's wrong with me? That daddy doesn't love me, right? And then it's not true. Like, we don't know what was going on in their relationship. We don't know what was going on in their minds and their mindsets, how they were trained and acculturated and conditioned about holding relationships by their parents and their parents before them, etc. We don't know what was going on with their brain biochemistry, with any substances that might have been at play. We take it on personally. We make it about us. And that's tragic and sad and not necessary, right? So, but we wouldn't know it unless we're willing to do the work of diving in and asking the hard questions and looking at the stuff that in some cases we spent years, decades running away from and not wanting to feel. And yet hard, heroic for sure, so worthwhile, because freedom, right? Personal empowerment, meaning and purpose. That's relationships that work, that have a chance at working. That's the rewards. Those are the rewards. So it all begins with self-awareness.
We talked a little bit about that turning point for you, and I was wondering if you would mind sharing maybe what has been the most profound change in your life since you've embraced this spiritual approach.
Oh my God, David! It's just the peace of mind, the inner peace, the freedom of knowing who I am, and the empowerment of I get to be who I am wherever I am. I don't have to present the facade or act this way at work and this other way with my partner and this other way at home and this other way with my parents. I just get to be who I am, wherever I am. And like what I was saying earlier, the fact that anything that happens in my life, like I never question my self-worth anymore. Like I never slip into self-doubt. I never slip into self-hatred ever. And of course, I learn from feedback. So it's not that I feel like I'm done. No, it's like I pay attention, and especially if I'm getting similar feedback from more than one source, then I really pay attention. But I don't do the extra layer of self punishment that often comes with that. So I go, well, what's wrong with me? I really messed up. That the number that we do to ourselves. We would never, the stuff we tell ourselves, we would never tell anybody else. It's what I call the self-inflicted mind F-bomb. I don't know if I could use the F-bomb in your podcast, but.
Yeah, we're all adults.
Okay, good. Yeah, because it sounds so much better when you actually say it. The self-inflicted mind fuck. Yeah. Right. And it's just so unnecessary, the number that we do on ourselves. So to have stopped that, it's like I live in awe and gratitude, and the fact that I'm living my purpose, and the fact that I'm at a stage in my life where I've learned that no relationship is going to make me happy, that only I am responsible for my own happiness, and how unfair to put that responsibility, you are going to make me happy, on somebody else. It's like, oh my God, it's so liberating. It's so empowering, and on and on and on. But I think if I were gonna it all comes from self-love, which is made possible by self-acceptance, which is made possible by self-awareness. So that's why self-awareness is the first step.
Which is incredible that we're talking about that particular thing right now, because prior to getting on with you, I drove my daughter to her mother's house, and on the way, Um, I asked her if she would be willing to you know, take part in this exercise with me that another guest actually talked with me about. It's really taking turns asking one another, who are you? And
Mm,
really taking a close look. And it's not necessarily for the other person to know who you are, but it's more for you to like really like, who am I? Because that is actually something that I've been struggling with. I've spent most of my adult life identifying as a firefighter, as you know, that was who I was. And now I don't do that anymore. And I've been really like, oh, man, what, who am I really? And like, I'm still trying to figure that out. And we had this amazing conversation. Um, and my daughter opened up to me in such a way that was so beautiful. And I've never had that conversation with anybody else,
mm.
but as far as like, never asked anybody on like at that level, like, who are you? And I'm curious because like you are clearly very self-aware. How would you tell tell your family or tell me or the audience, who are you?
Oh man, David, that's a good question. I've been doing dozens of these interviews. Nobody has asked me that. And I love that process, by the way. I don't know if it's the same way that I do it, but you keep asking, right? Who are
Yes,
you?
yeah,
And
yeah.
who are you? So keep going deeper and keep going deeper and keep going deeper to see what comes out. Um, and it's an amazing, very powerful process. Um, so, I think this goes back to what we're talking about, the ego and the baseball and the stadium. Um, And so, what I now know, not that I'm there every minute of the day, but what I know I am is the stadium, right? So, my own piece of sacred real estate that expresses itself and breathes and animates me. Um, and we all are that, right? We're all that. We just forgot and we think, well, there's tiny, tiny little baseball. Um, and so, once we understand, which is the first step, understanding how the baseball works and the self-made prison of the baseball, then we are not only at choice in terms that we don't have to react every time somebody presses our buttons. And in fact, those buttons eventually get flattened so that anybody can press them and nothing happens. Um, but we get to live from that place of expansive awareness, which almost has like different physics. Like, we don't have the language to explain, but we use words like miracles or magic and, synchronicity, stuff that the rational mind cannot explain how stuff like that happens. Um, and so it is a magic lived life. Um, doesn't mean that yeah, we don't feel the ups and downs of life. Of course, we're always human, and there's going to be pain. There's going to be ecstasy. People are going to come. People are going to go. We're going to witness tragic stuff. We're going to witness incredibly mind-blowing, beautiful, generous stuff. And all throughout, we get to maintain that sense of awareness that we are this pocket of consciousness, this, which the Buddhists call the witness consciousness. Um, that is having that experience, having all those experiences, that is having all those emotions, but it doesn't mean that we are those emotions or those experiences. We are so much greater than the jobs that we do. We are so much greater that all the quote unquote bad stuff we've done in the past, so much greater than our addictions, so much greater than all our shortcomings. We are so much greater than our DNA. We are so much greater than all of it. Like, and for me, I feel blessed. That is my primary reference point. And so then the rest of it is details, right? Like, all right, what do I want to do? Right? But rather than, then we come at it from a whole different perspective, rather than which is a whole other conversation too. How do we know what our purpose is? We don't have time to get into it now. But I do whole weekend retreats on that. But knowing that, it's like, to me, that's our deepest source of fulfillment. Like, I'm glad I don't have to choose between having sex, because I love sex, and my living my purpose, living my mission. But if I had to, I don't even have to think about it. It's a clear answer what I would choose.
Such an incredible conversation. I can't thank you enough for allowing me to interview you. What an amazing book. And I look forward, well, I'm looking forward to reading it, not just once, but multiple times. And I've shared it, and I know that, I can't recommend the book enough. So, it's a very easy read. It is fun, and it's super interesting. So much so that I've gone back and read the first 3 chapters multiple times. Like I've gotten so much out of it. Well, I showed you, I've highlighted so many things, and it's just very well informed, thought out. It's not like, we've talked about spirituality and the like. It never struck me as being, um, any kind of religious, or it's more about really embracing who you are, and discovering who you are. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I love it. And
Thank you so much. That means so much coming from you, David, and I so honor the work that you're doing. And this new model of leadership that you're teaching others and mentoring for others and embodying, which is more about service, which totally connects to the difference between worldly power and soulful power, which is about service and making a difference, rather than, I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're going to do it my way or the highway. So I'm so grateful for the opportunity. I love this connection and this conversation. And hey, we just live close to each other. We're neighbors. So
yeah, I will definitely reach out, because I go south quite often. So
let me know.
next time I'm down there, I'll take you out for a drink,
I
because
love that.
I love Miami. It's beautiful.
Good.
Um, is there anything that you can think of that we did not touch on that you feel is very important, before we go? Just something to leave the audience with.
There's so much more in the book that we didn't get to, but if we can like re-highlight a message, is that there is a way that we can step into our own power that is a match with the goodness in our hearts. That doesn't require that we abuse anybody. It doesn't require that we be corrupted. It doesn't require that we push anybody down, step on them in order for us to feel powerful. Like, we can do this. And there is a way that we can free ourselves from whatever happened. And I'm not minimizing anybody's trauma. But I know it's possible to heal it all. I know that.
Again, thank you so much. And again, if you're looking to connect with Christian, you can connect with him via his website, soulfulpower.com, soulfulpower.com. And make sure you check out his book. And I'll have a link to his website in the show notes. So again, thank you so much. And uh, the next step for me is to watch your TEDx talk.
Thank you again. Thank you again for doing all you do and for having me on the show. And I look forward to what's next.
Thank you for listening to this episode of From Embers to Excellence. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on your favorite podcast platform and visit hollenbachleadership.com for additional content. My goal is and always will be to add value to as many people as possible. So if I can be of any assistance to you or someone you know, please connect with me via email or on one of my social media accounts, linked on the homepage of my website. Remember, our failures don't define us unless we let them, and the only true measure of a leader is the success of their team.